we're looking at the archaeology and history of lakes in Cymru. And it's a very difficult one tonight. If you are thinking that I'm not going to talk about fairies and King Arthur, I will. But I think the history and archaeology element will be looking at 2 of 4 of the lakes that I feature, and I'm going to be featuring another lake where there's talk of debauchery and various other things going on. So that's going to be the lake that we're going to look at the end. I will introduce Gorse Krannog and Gorse Lake. So I've got a few nice facts that I'm going to chuck in here. And these are in particular with Gorse Lake and Cloyn Van Fach, which is in the Black Mountains, and that's in West Wales. So I was introduced to this wonderful lake in 1989. The archaeologist, Dr. Mark Redknapp, was excavating the Krannog. Now we know of another 2 Krannogs in the whole of Cymru, but up until 1989, we did not know that Krannogs existed in this fair land of ours. And what is a Krannog? A Krannog is a man-made platform. We'll look at a little bit about this because it's actually within the lake. So it's classed as the lake archaeology. So that's how I want to concentrate. A Krannog, Krannogs can be found a number in Ireland. I've got a reconstructed photograph of a Krannog in Ireland. We find lots of Krannogs in Scotland. One Krannog was found not so long ago in Monmouthshire way by the wonderful archaeologist Stephen Clark, who's a very good friend of mine. But we need to concentrate on this lake. So how do we concentrate on lakes? By showing you an image of one, which would be quite appropriate. And one thing that I'm going to do is that. And Bill was very right in identifying this lake. Very misty, very mythical looking. But we'll look at a few archaeological facts in regards to this one. So there's Gorse Lake. It sits quite nicely in the southern part of, I should actually say, the more middle part of the Brecon Beacon range, but it's sat quite nicely. And if any of you ever get an opportunity to go and see it, there's lots going on there. So this little copse of trees is on a man-made platform 40 meters away from the coast. And it might be interesting, actually, and I'm going to take a note of this. Maybe we should look at Krannogs and a comparison in regards to Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and we'll ditch Cornwall for that one, and we'll ditch Cumbria. So that might be an interesting class in the next few months in connection with the Wednesday evening, because there are no Krannogs that I'm aware of in Cornwall and none in Cumbria, but I'm sure there might be 1 or 2 found in the future. So with the lake archaeology, we need to look at this platform. The lake itself is a natural lake. It's no deeper than 7.5 meters. And the first major find was made on the lake, actually in the lake, in 1925. There were probably other things found, I think, what I've got as well. And what we find is a complete dugout boat. And if I'm right in thinking, either that's in the Brecon Museum or it's in the National Museum of Wales, but they found a complete dugout boat in 1925. It's rather interesting, this, because it's not a Bronze Age boat. It's not an Iron Age boat. It's actually coming nicely into that period of the early medieval period that my history teacher used to tell me that nobody lived in Wales. So the dugout canoe, nicely radiocarbon dated years later to around the 800s, ties in quite nicely with the Krannog itself. Since then, lots of other boat-like remains have been found on the lake. And look at that. So sometimes it's very misty. Like many of these lakes, they're either found up in the gods, or usually they're found in sort of clefts surrounded by mountain ranges, which is not dissimilar to what we're actually looking at. And when you think about this, you think myths and legends, Ladies of the Lake and King Arthur, but not with this one, may I add. So the archaeological excavations 1989 to 1993, and you'll be right in thinking, Goff, that this was, I do believe, the 4th episode of a new series known as Time Team back in the day. And they actually went there in 1993, broadcast in 1994. So the Krannog itself, and there she blows. There she is over there, nice little bit of a Krannog, 40 meters away from the shoreline, is actually made up of, like this example from Ireland, it's made up of a layer of stone, a layer of soil, and a layer of brushwood. And it fits into a very odd period, as I say, a period that my history teacher used to think nobody lived in Wales, but also a period that's full of those myths and legends and saints and various things that go bump in the night. When we think about this Krannog, not only do we have archaeological evidence, we do have historical evidence as well, which is quite nice. And you know what? I love Anglo-Saxon names like Queen Ethelfried. I love it. Now, Ethelfried was the queen, unless she was a cross-dresser. I was just about to say king. Was the queen of the Mercians. And there was a dispute that arose between the leaders, the kings and queens of Brycheiniog, which is the old name for Brecon, and the Mercians. And it all came about by the abducting of an abbot, a Mercian abbot, known as Erchobrit, love it, Erchobrit, and he was murdered along with a number of his personnel by the people of Brycheiniog. So Queen Ethelfried went to the lake, besieged the Krannog, captured it and burnt it to the ground. Now, why is that interesting? It's very interesting because that ties in not quite nicely with the archaeological evidence, because the date is 916. And then we get the name of the kings and queens of Brycheiniog. So there you go. And we do see it being written down that there's a little bit of fighting. But the archaeological evidence within the lake, and actually from the Krannog itself, tells us about those events. And I think it's very intriguing that we can tie in historical figures with the archaeological evidence. So they found lots of wooden evidence, lots of evidence of tools. But what I think I will do is leave the actual detail of the Krannog for now. But when they did excavate, they did find. Sorry for the interferences. We've sorted that one out. And we were looking at this wonderful Gorse, and we were looking at Gorse Krannog. I don't know how far we got with Gorse Krannog, but I was definitely telling you about the story of Queen Ethelfried. Queen Ethelfried in 916 had decided to invade the territory of the kingdom of Brycheiniog. And she headed with her army to Gorse Krannog, where the queen apparently was in residence. Now, this must have been some kind of retreat. So interesting enough, in the archaeology, we've got a date. Queen Ethelfried of the Mercians headed towards Gorse Krannog and besieged this locality. in response to the murder of a certain Bishop Eckelbricht of the Mercians, and he was killed by the Kingdom of Krannog. So they besieged this locality. I think we've actually got precise figures of the numbers who were killed as well. We're not talking in the hundreds, but you know, enough people are killed. And then the archaeology tells us that at one point, the site sees it to be abandoned. And we have a destruction layer at this site. So not only do we have historical reference, we know why there's this destruction layer at the site. We know the events, and that is great that we've got a nice bit of a picture. We've got a nice bit of a jigsaw puzzle. So when Time Team were here, 1993, broadcast in 1994, it painted more of the picture in connection with Langorse Lake. Lots more artifacts have been found, but what we're going to do, we're going to leave that to our archaeology of Cornwall, Cumbria, and Orkney when we look at comparisons in the past. So as we move away from the lake, and Bill was very right in identifying this locality, I mentioned as well that you look at these various landscapes and you see them set with surrounded by mountains. This is the site we're going to go to next, but before that, another view of Langorse Krannog, and this is an example of an excavated Krannog in Ireland. And this actually shows the layers. I did mention at Langorse Krannog at the beginning that various layers of stone, soil, brushwood to create an artificial island within a lake. And this is what this is showing, a completely excavated version. But now we move on. We move on to this locality, which is where, Bill?
That is Llynfawr.
Llynfanfarch, exactly. Llynfanfarch. Well,
yeah, the Ricos.
Well, I've got Llynfanfarch on this one. So what I've got is some nice notes. And those nice notes are on my screen, and I will tell you about them. We've got a little bit of a story about this, and this is a wonderful locality. Like the previous Langorse Krannog, which is 327 acres in area, like that one, this looks like it's been created as part of the great glacial changes that we saw the landscape exposed to thousands of years ago. So Llyn Irfanfarch itself is a lake that isn't as big as Langorse Krannog. It's 25 acres in area. It's within the Black Mountains, which Bill, you'll be familiar with. Yeah. It's known as the Lake of the Small Hill. And there are two of these lakes. This is a smaller of the two. And the depth of this is a little bit more than the previous one. So when we looked at the depth of Langorse Lake, being just over 7 meters in depth, from water horizon to the depth, it's nearly 30 meters in depth. So it's full of all those myths and legends and things that go bump in the night. So, Bill, you have actually been to this locality. Tell us a little bit more about it.
I've stood on the top and looked down. Is that the lake where they found the famous Iron Age cauldron and other bits and pieces? Or not?
I don't. You know what?
It might be the other one with the Ricos I mentioned earlier, the Llynfawr. That is Black Mountain there.
I think it might be, because in my notes it doesn't actually mention that at all. But I do know what you're talking about. I think you're talking. Yeah, I think you're talking about the other one, because it's a much more sizable lake, the other one.
Yeah.
So what I'd like to do, I'd like you to all to settle back and to listen to a little folk legend. Are you all nicely seated? And as Bill would say, settle down.
Settle down.
A folklore legend is connected with the lake, known as the Lady of the Lake. And I've told a part of this story before. In the folk tale, a local young man, son of a widow from Blaen Southey, which is Llandysant or near Llandysant, agreed to marry a beautiful girl who arose from the lake, with the condition that he would not hit her 3 times. I think that's a quite a reasonable request. He complied. He complied easily because the girl was so beautiful, and they were happy for years, putting up a house on Esgair Lleifi near Myddfai. Now, we've mentioned about the physicians of Myddfai before. So they set up a house there, a farmhouse, naturally, and bringing up a family there. The girl had very special cattle. Traditionally, these same cattle, the white cattle, are kept at Dynevor, Llandilo, and other animals she brought with her out of the lake. So very interesting story, Lady of the Lake with various animals. But over time, the man did hit her 3 times. And it's been long discussed why he hit her. Reasons for why he hit her vary, from the wife laughing at a funeral or crying at a wedding. Regardless, he had hit her 3 times, which is the magic number. And that magic number meant that she had to go back to the lake. Regardless of anything else. So, when she went back to the lake, you had to do so as part of the condition. So she took her cattle with her and all the other animals. And one of the things with the legend is that among the cattle was a team of 4 oxen, which were ploughing at the time. They followed the Lady of the Lake and ploughed along the length. And it said that we know that she took with her the oxen and the plough, because they still say to this very day, you may see a well-marked furrow running right across Myddfai Mountain to the edge of Llyn yr Van Fach, which proves this story to be true. And no doubt, if there's loads of cattle bones at the bottom of the lake, it would bear out the story as being fact. But the mother did return to visit her 4 sons, and in particular one called Rhywalon. In some versions, Rhywalon is the name of the young man who marries the fairy girl. In due course, Rhywalon and the other sons went to the court of Gichreig at Deheubarth. Now, you've been with me to Deheubarth, Bill and Peter, and I mentioned about Gichreig, the great king of Deheubarth, where they became famous doctors who are known today as the physicians of Myddfai. Michelle actually bought a book at a gift shop, and it said that a number of medical formula remain in the Welsh manuscripts. So what we're going to find is that the other 2 lakes that we look at do bear out some of these myths and legends. And you know what, Bill? I was going to look at the lake with the cauldron tonight, but I wanted to look at some of the other legends. And what I might do is the last lecture, I might do part of looking at some lakes across our wonderful land and another subject as well. So let's have a little look at these images before we look at the next lake. Now, the next lake is going to be one very familiar to you. And which lake may that be, folks? Which lake would I look at, which is very local to us, Bill?
Well, you mentioned Gorse, haven't you?
Yeah, so which other one? Which is the one that Dell would love us to talk about?
Oh, you mean Kenfig?
Yes, bingo. So before we actually go to Kenfig, these are actually very enigmatic views. And looking at this, I do believe that this is formed in an extinct volcanic caldera, but I could be excused for being wrong on that one. So there it is, Llyn i'r Fan Fach, way up there in the Brecon Beacon Range. Bill.
Black Mountains. Yeah.
That's the Black Mountains. That's correct. And there is another view of it. Just go back again. That's another view. Nice view. It's not a large lake. It's only 25 acres, but you know, nowhere near as big as Langorse Krannog, the Langorse Lake with the Krannog. But as we move on, I think these are really beautiful views. This would have been full of trees at one stage as well. And here we go at Kenfig Pool. Now, I've read various things about Kenfig Pool. And one of the statements was that at one stage, this was the second biggest lake in Wales. And there's lots of stories about it being a natural lake, being formed because the town of Kenfig was consumed by sand dunes, and the various rivers flowed into one sometime in the medieval period. Is it an ancient lake? All those different stories, glacial lake and so on. So what I've actually got is a nice little story from a Mary Trevelyan book, her book Folklore and Folk Stories of Wales. Again, very enigmatic, and there it is on the map. So going back to that one. Good. And it goes as follows. And what I've got a little bit from the book, and I've got another bit of information on there as well. And I will not spend the next time looking at Kenfig, but we will look at Kenfig for now. Kenfig Pool has a tradition attached to it. A local chieftain wronged and wounded a prince, and the latter, with his dying breath, pronounced a curse against the wrongdoer. The curse was forgotten by all, until one night the descendants of the chieftain heard a fearful cry, "Dial thou, dial thou, vengeance is coming, vengeance is coming." At first it passed unnoticed, but when the cry was repeated night after night, "Dial thou, vengeance is coming," the owner of Kenfig asked the domestic bard what it meant. The bard repeated the old story of revenge, but his master, to prove the untrustworthiness of the warning, ordered a grand feast with music and song. In the midst of the carousal, it's not a word you often hear, is it, carousal? The fearful warning cry was repeatedly heard, dial thou, vengeance is coming." And suddenly the earth trembled and water rushed into the palace, the castle, and the town. Before anyone could escape, the town of Kenfig, with its palace, houses, and people, was swallowed up, and only a deep and dark lake, the one in front of us, or pool, remains to mark the scene of the disaster. In the early part of the 1800s, traces of masonry could be seen and felt with grappling irons in the pool. The sands nearby cover many old habitations. Now, I like that, but there's a little bit more information that we're going to look at. So let's look at my little screen whilst you're looking at that, and put my glasses on. Now, this is rather interesting. So a little bit more information, but it ties in the other couple of lakes with this as well. Many Welsh lakes have legends and myths connected to them, and Kenfig Pool is no exception, having associations, as we've already heard, with a legendary drowned town under the lake and a real town buried under sand nearby. It's known as Pwlch Kenfig. There has been a human settlement in this area since the Bronze Age, and perhaps because of this long history, it is steeped in legend and folklore from many ages. One of the most mysterious is the legend of the drowned town under Kenfig Pool. And adding to mystique and romance, there was also a real town of Kenfig. This town was abandoned after being completely covered by the shifting sands of a massive dune, which once ran along the Welsh shoreline. So that ties in with this next point, which we're going to mention. According to one local tradition, an earthquake caused the land to sink and fill with water, creating Kenfig Pool. This idea is not supported by experts, and a more modern explanation from Cardiff University claims that before the shifting of the sand, the river Kenfig ran south towards Scare Rocks, out at sea today, on the southern part of Kenfig Beach, and the pool is all that now remains. So it was a vast, vast lake. Another explanation supported by a historical document of 1360 tells that a stream called the Brachlach, which doesn't sound Welsh to me, Brachlach, flowed along the west side of the buried Kenfig town. Another local tradition says that 7 springs fed the pool, but are now believed to have dried up. The Brachlach was an outlet for it. Whatever the truth of its origin, the pool was said to be a dangerous place, with a whirlwind in the southwest part of it that dragged boaters and swimmers underwater to drown. Now, Michelle found something also in this wonderful book of Mary Trevelyan, and it's linked to that very word whirlpool. But before we look at that very word whirlpool, I would like to give you a little bit more history, which is about the extensive landscape of Kenfig, which takes us a bit away from lakes, but I think you guys might appreciate this. During the medieval period, the town of Kenfig was situated near the sea, as we know, and was a borough built around a castle. The burgess plots had a charter within the walls, which gave them the right to make bylaws and to raise taxes. Kenfig was a prosperous town with considerable community resources, such as a hospital and a guild hall, and hospitality buildings as well. There were many laws which were designed to ensure a good standard of commodities such as beer, bread, and other foods, and there were controls on weights and measures to ensure fair practice. The Normans built the castle in an attempt to impose themselves on the local people. So what we're talking about, it had been a town before the damnable Normans got there. Although the local people of the Cymru sacked the castle several times, it was the forces of nature that finally overcame it. As we've already mentioned, this happened during the 1200s and into the 1300s, when powerful storms caused massive quantities of sand to build up along the coastline. The wind carried the sand inland, so that the town of Kenfig and its castle were buried underneath tons of sand. Today, all that can be seen is the top of Kenfig Castle, which protrudes from the sand. So, what I'm going to do is tell you this other little story, and then we'll look at one other site, and we'll look at a little bit of an intimation of another one, and then we'll call it a night, because it's certainly getting late. This is the latest that Gough has ever been up. So a little bit more about the lake. There you go, a nice, lovely image. It's a really nice spot to wander around, as long as there's no other people wandering about. And there is the lake from above. It looks great, doesn't it? A very dark pool, as the description gets it. So here we go. The Whirlpool mention. And where we're going to go is actually, we're going to go to the River Taff on this one. But this explains the Whirlpool mention where people would lose their lives. The Whirlpool in the River Taff at Cardiff forms a small lake when the bed is almost dry. In the days of old, this whirlpool was called one of the 7 wonders of Glamorgan. People said it was fathomless, and in its cavernous depths a monstrous serpent dwelt and gorged on the unfortunate victims that were drowned in the river and sucked into the bottomless whirlpool. When any bodies were not recovered, from this whirlpool, people said they had been swallowed up by the serpent, and agonies of torture possessed the minds of those whose relatives were so ill-fated. When a body came to the surface, it was thought that the person was very good, because the serpent would not touch the corpse of the righteous. And I thought that was nice. There's another little story about the whirlpool here, but it takes us further away from Kenfig. So as we move on a little bit more, we are now going to go here. Thanks to Michelle in introducing this site, we're going to go to my little book again. If you may bear with me. Make sure I got this right. Good. Right, so just got to put this on a minute. And I've got to put a code in 40808. We're next going to look at, I've got a little technical problem with it. Put my glasses on. And this is known as Lean Barfog or Barhog. And if we can show you where this is, we go to Snowdonia. It's just inland from Aberdyfi. It's a rather interesting one. So here we go, Welsh lake legends and folklore. Llyn Barfog. In Wales, legends and folklore of King Arthur and the other world are never far away, and lakes are often the setting of such stories. One such lake is Llyn Barfog, which is also known as the Bearded Lake, or the Bearded One's Lake, and is situated in a remote and lonely spot in Snowdonia. Some say it got its epitaph from the yellow water lilies that float upon its surface, or the reeds that fringe its banks. Another explanation says that it is named after a legendary being called the Bearded One. Who the Bearded One was remains a mystery, but there are two other legends associated with the lake that more are known about and are presented here. So we're going to look at one of them. The first tells how a poor farmer came across one of the milk white cows owned by the dwellers from the other world. Now, if we think about it, that links very similarly with the other example of a lake. And the second tells of how King Arthur rid the lake of a monster called Avanc. And we've also got mention of the white cow here as well, which is great. And also Anoin. In Welsh mythology and tradition, many of the Welsh lakes are regarded as doorways to and from Anoin, or the other world. Many people believe that the lakes to be connected to one another by underground rivers or subterranean ways that made them one vast underworld. So all these lakes that we're talking about were linked. There are examples of inhabitants of the other worlds appearing from some of these lakes, such as the fairies of Llyn Vanfach and Llyn Coch, to spend time on earth and then return to their own world. Llyn Barfog appears to be one of the many such lakes in Welsh folklore, where the dwellers of Anoin have entry and exit to the earthly underworld. So what we're going to do, let's look a little bit more about the legend tells how Llyn Barfog is associated with mythical beings called the Gichreig Anoin, also known as the Elfin Dames, who were female dwellers of Anoin, the underworld. At times, these can be seen in the distance on the hills and mountaintops. They were often accompanied by pure white dogs, known as Coin the dogs of Anoin, and were either driving or tending a herd of milk-white cattle known as the Kenfig History. Both the dogs and the cattle were said to have had reddish-coloured ears and white coats. The local people all knew about them. They had often seen them from afar for fleeting moments before they would vanish, and few had ever seen them up close. They realized they were Gichreig Anoin, who lived under the hills and lakes of Wales, and steered clear of them. The males were the plant Anoin and were often associated with Nude, who was the lord of the underworld. And there's lots about these wonderful, there's these wonderful white cows. And we cannot finish tonight without the story about King Arthur. Llyn Barog features King Arthur, who was called upon to vanquish a water monster called the Avanc. There are no reliable descriptions of what an Avanc looked like. Sometimes it is described as a crocodile-like creature, while others say it is like a giant beaver. Others describe it as a creative looking dwarf. Whatever they may look like, they are generally seen as water monsters or spirits that live in lakes, pools, and rivers. They cause them to flood and will kill humans recklessly. Sometimes they will leave their lairs to seek out and kill people out of malice. This legend tells how an Avanc caused trouble for local people. It would kill anyone who ventured close to Llyn Barfog, where it had its lair. And every now and then it went on the rampage, seeking out and murdering people and animals. Sometimes it would cause the lake to flood as it moved around in the water. At last, the local people tired of it and begged King Arthur to rid them of the troublesome beast. King Arthur rode his mare named Lamrai up to the lake. He had brought him a strong magical chain which he managed to drape over the head of the monster while it was lying asleep in the water. The Avanc woke suddenly and, feeling the chain around its neck, realized it was under attack and began to fight and struggle. King Arthur urged his horse forward, trying to pull the beast from the lake. As the monster struggled, his horse placed its foot on a rock and pushed so hard it left its imprint there. This rock is known as Carn Mark Arthur, supposedly an imprint with the hoofprint of Arthur's horse Lamrai. They often, these marks, these mythical imprints are found across Wales, particularly the ones at the lake. They often have religious or cultural symbolism and are found in many places around the world. They can be artificially made of or occur naturally. Sometimes they are linked to saints, or in this case, they're linked to King Arthur. As for the Avanc, there are two versions of its fate. The first says that Arthur killed it, but the second says that Arthur and his horse dragged it to a more remote lake called Llyn Cadair Idris. There it could do less harm and remains to this day. And that, my friends, is the last story tonight with images. But I'd like to give you one last story. So stories looking at these lakes. There it is. And I found one here. And if you could all bear with me a second. I'll tell you this in a mo. Hang on. And I do apologise for some of the pronunciation of the words tonight because I've got some nasal problems. There's one last lake that I wanted to mention. It's known as Llyn Mice, which is in Cardiganshire. Its name means the Lake of the Field, which according to tradition covers the ancient site of Tregaron. The people of this old place were very wicked and went to excesses in all ways. Most of their time was spent in revelry, feasting, and hideous orgies, and incessant forms of every kind of pleasure and debauchery in those days. Many times had the people been warned that the place would be destroyed by fire and flood if they did not cease their wickedness, instead of which they grew worse as the years passed. One night, when the revelry was at its height, lightning caused a fire to break out, and a flood followed, completely overwhelming the place. Not a single person escaped, for those who were not burned were drowned. And that is in Cardiganshire, near the old lost village of Tregaron. On that note, hopefully you've all enjoyed this evening. So I'm just going to find out if there are any questions.
Yeah, I got a few, Carl. You mentioned Kenfig Pool, the River Kenfig, and the medieval town of Kenfig, just to add a bit of local knowledge. And up on Margam Mountain, where you have the famous 6th century Bodwick stone,
Yes.
immediately next to the stone is a pool, and that pool is the source of the River Kenfig.
Yes.
One interesting point, okay? The Kenfig Pool itself, there's another legend, and that is during storm conditions, when the water is very rough, a lot of wave motion, etc., you can actually hear the old town bell clanging away just under the surface.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
That's one. And as regards to the medieval village, people think it's totally gone, which is basically true. But if you know where to look underneath some scrub, you can still see the last remaining bit of the town, which is a few masonry courses, a corner course of a cottage or something like that of a building, if you know where to look. And that's quite close to the remains of the castle, you know.
And obviously you've got the castle there.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Guildhall as well. The Guildhall is now part of the Prince of Wales pub in the upper room there. And that's where, when the Time Team dig went on a few years back, that's where they actually discussed things in the upper room in the old Guildhall. So it's a very interesting area, Kenfig, apart from the beauty of it and the lovely walks around there.
And also, Pat remembers that because she got chased across the field by some white cows with big horns. What about you, Pete? Anything quick before we finish, because it is late?
No, it'd be fine. No, that's good.
It was worth hanging on for then, Goff, was it?
Yeah, it was great. Thanks, Carl. Very good.
So obviously me and Pat need to work out changing our supplier if this is going to happen with Sky. Pat, anything you'd like to say quickly before we finish?
No, I just remember that guild hall upstairs. It was fantastic.
Yeah, we are, isn't it? Yeah, very interesting. The beer's good.
Anyway, I really appreciate your patience tonight for that disaster. And many thanks for keeping on. And I will see you I will see you tomorrow, all of you, I think, except for Pete. And I'm going to call it a night now. If no other questions, I'm going to say thank you, Pete, Bill, Pat, and Goff, and also Pam. And I will see you all soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Carl. Bye now.
Night, folks. Night.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Night.
Good night. Good night.